this week's Stateline, could proposed federal laws bulldoze the state's heritage?
And it basically reverses 25 years of established practice.
But first, to a controversial proposal to change the way we treat the state's historic buildings. The federal government's Productivity Commission has just released a report calling for a radical reform of how properties are heritage listed. Everyone agrees the existing system has its flaws, but it's feared the new plan could see a free-for-all for developers.
This is Death Row at North Adelaide. These three historic homes on McKinnon Parade are about to be consigned to history themselves.
Demolition is due shortly, but
the North Adelaide Society has been fighting to keep places such as these, but victories have been scarce.
If you have a look at this particular example, it's still got very good characteristics of that early Victorian feel. The tessellated tile veranda is still intact. You look at some of the ornamentation to the building and you can see that there's nothing really wrong with the building.
These homes that go back to European settlement will be replaced with modern architecture.
There'll be residences there, but of a two-storey form and of a much bulkier, more massive appearance. And the one here at 109 is definitely going to look like a concrete bunker.
It's a trend that's long been worrying heritage groups, and it's feared proposed federal heritage laws might throw open the door altogether for developers and their bulldozers.
Basically reverses 25 years of established practice. The whole existing heritage regime would be reviewed, and one would assume as a consequence of any review that's undertaken that places would be reconsidered and perhaps as a consequence of that delisted.
We released a draft report.
The Productivity Commission has devised the plan that proposes the national system for heritage listing. It met in Adelaide today to take proposes individual conservation agreements be drawn up for each property, effectively making listing voluntary.
A system of volunteers rather than conscripts probably produces a much more conducive outcome for community support and community attitude. That is an oversimplification as to what we have in mind, but certainly we think at the moment the over-reliance on prescriptive regulation has gone too far.
The Commission says current laws are a mess. Some houses are being listed when they shouldn't be, others are being lost.
The threat of listing or actual listing is having a perverse effect. Conservation is not occurring. And in fact, some properties that should be conserved are being neglected, so we have demolition by neglect because of concerns about the implications of listing.
It's a pretty naive proposition to suggest that a property owner will have a discussion and a debate with someone from the local council and will necessarily forego the opportunity, if they're a developer, to build 15 units on a block of land.
The Commission has met with unexpected opposition in Adelaide today. Joan Lomax-Smith made a fiery speech. She says North Adelaide has been losing heritage homes because it already works under a voluntary listing model, and she fears it will get even worse if it's enforced across the state.
Inevitably, you will end up over time with the only protected buildings being government-owned buildings. Domestic or privately owned buildings would all tend to be losing their listing.
It might seem surprising that a body that answers to the Federal Treasurer is looking into heritage, but it was the lobbying of heritage groups, such as the National Trust, that brought it on. They had hoped for new financial incentives to encourage conservation. They didn't expect this.
So is this something that might have backfired, do you think?
Well, certainly in terms of the suggested recommendations at this stage, you'd have to say yes.
The National Trust believes what's proposed favours developers when there should be a more holistic approach. It wanted measures to ease the burden of costs on heritage building owners. Instead, it might give them the option to sidestep conservation.
We could have, for example, made some investigation about a taxation rebate to private owners of heritage properties so that they were rebated for conservation works that they undertook on their properties that they owned.
These houses were built without electric tools or much else. They were basically built by hand. And
Tim Simpson is a heritage consultant. His job is to breathe new life into some of Adelaide's old homes. Like others, he's worried the Commission's financial background means it isn't placing enough importance on history. And he also worries that the Commission and many homeowners might be getting the sums wrong, that painstaking renovations might be worth it in the long run.
This was an absolute shocker. It was covered in a ugly white render. When we took that off, we discovered this beautiful stonework underneath. When that's repointed and dressed up, I wouldn't hazard a guess as to exactly how much value would be added to the house, but certainly it would be a lot more than the cost of the renovation.
We don't see it pro-development or anti-development. We see it as balancing the interests of property owners relative to the public good that flows from the conservation of historic heritage places.
Paul McCarthy with that report, and the Commission's final report will be out in 2 months' time.